Hi, everyone. This month, Jim and I are going to talk about the importance of including all of the stakeholders in an executive search and succession process. And to begin with, we want to talk about what a stakeholder is in the first place, as it's a bit of a unclear term. For some people, this means shareholders, the folks who own the business, are ultimately uh, the key decision makers, and everything is designed to benefit shareholders in some capacity. Um, in other cases, people mean stakeholders as those that are in the C-suite and have the decision authority necessary at the top of the org chart to run the business. And while those are true stakeholders in very real capacities, when we think about working with family companies, we want to broaden the lens of what a stakeholder means to include people that might not even necessarily be in the org chart. The first one that we want to hit on here, we like to call the retired stakeholder. Oftentimes, this is a founder. Sometimes it is a G2 or G3 family member who is out of the org chart. They are sometimes even tendered their shares. They no longer own the business, yet they still exist outside of the business and assert their influence. It's really important to bring those people in to an executive search process, particularly when selecting a chief executive officer. And we're going to explore that one first. Jim, what are your thoughts on that kind of retired stakeholder and how they can influence a process?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up first because it is probably the most significant of the group. And we see this happening quite often in organizations where there's been a long tenured leader in the business that has chosen or reached the point of retirement and yet is so highly acclaimed by his family and the management team that they'll bow down for that person. And what happens is that the influence that comes from that chair can undermine everything that is trying to be done. Any good idea can be changed by that person saying no. And what has to be understood from our perspective is you can't change that exactly, but you have to understand it as you walk into the relationship. And what I mean is that, let's say there is a person hired and they don't understand the implication of the person behind the scenes. And
Mhm.
they think they can originate a plan and they have it all ready to roll out. And then the big foot goes down and it's no, we're not doing that. I've never done that and it won't happen here. So it has to be explained, has to be seen, should be challenged. All of it, though, needs to be adapted to for a successful project.
Yeah, I had a couple things here. In a lot of cases like this, when you have a retired stakeholder that's in asserting their influence, what you have there is the policies and processes and procedures have effectively become a paper tiger, where the organization says, "Well, this is it, the way that we run things," but then you have an outside person who comes in and just bulldozes that and asserts their influence anyways. That can be a huge waste of time for all of the capital and time and capital invested in a process, but it also can undermine the staff in an organization. But most critically, perhaps, is forget the process and imagine you go through and you're bringing a new person into your organization and you have not included that retired stakeholder in the process. That it means that the person who's accepted this job is unaware of what the real landscape they're going to be operating in will be, and you increase the risk of attrition or conflict between that person and the way the company is truly managed. So the next one that we want to go into here, we like to dub the unwilling incumbent. And this is another situation where you can look at policy and procedure as being a bit of a paper tiger. And you'll see this in circumstances where a company, an organization, believes in succession planning and they are asking a position holder of influence in a business to participate in the succession process when they personally do not feel that their role is complete and they still have more to give and they still want to work longer. And this kind of unwilling participant can become a big thorn in the process of succession planning. Jim, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. This is a case where you have someone that has reached their end of their shelf life, to say it nicely, and it should be ending, and yet they aren't really ready to go. And if they stay in chair and they don't buy into the process, What happens is that the person coming in is underpowered right away. The person who's coming in feels that they have a job to do, and that job can't be done without the approval of this person who essentially won't leave. And so, if the person won't leave, doesn't leave, whether it's in reality or just in the sense of their influence, it undermines the effectiveness of the new person in the job, makes it impossible for them to be happy. And maybe more importantly, I like the word attrition there. If it's a strong individual that you've hired and they come into the organization and they're expecting to do something, and the minute they're shot down the third time, it's pretty well over because they can't succeed there. They can't be happy there. And the changes that we all wanted when we initiated the search can't happen because the person in the chair has not been willing to let go. And
Mm.
now I'll add one last piece to that. This can be helped if it's understood in the beginning, if the implication of that person, the effect of that person is explained to the person, and they understand how they're going to hurt others and the organization, they'll oftentimes understand the need to step back. But it needs to be worked through. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes patience and persistence.
I appreciate that. I'd add a few things. One of the telltale signs when you're in a succession planning process for an individual, and there's a version of this line that we hear a lot that is, "I will die at my desk." You cannot put a succession plan in place for a person who is never going to leave their desk. And if you're beginning to do that, you are going to end up wasting time and causing conflict. There's this notion where, like, I actually think it comes from media or comes from the past. I'm not sure, but this idea of a gold watch, where you're going to take someone who has been committed their career to a company, and you're going to give them a gold watch, and then they sail off in the sunset, and everyone's happy. In most cases, when we're working with families, there's no real way to give these long-term people a gold watch and ask them to exit. And there's this big focus on what next is for the role they're in without a focus on what next is for the incumbent. If you don't start with where that person is going to move, and it doesn't mean that they just are exited from the company. You can't exit them from the company. So instead, you need to look at how they're going to add value while still making space for a new person to come into the business. Moving on to the next stakeholder, we want to look at next gens. We don't necessarily mean the next gen that is in their mid 40s or 50s and has all of the career experience ready to be the new leader of the company. We want to look at the next gens that are more maybe, say, 25 years old to 30 years old that have a lot of career ahead of them. They're not going to be considered as the next CEO of your family company, but they have your last name and everyone in your business knows who they are. Jim, can you reflect on how those people can influence an executive search and succession planning process?
Ah, yes, the tangled web that we all face in that scenario. Because typically that issue happens not because of that next gen, because of that next gen's uncle or mother or father, who is, in a sense, pulling the strings and saying, why isn't Johnny being considered for this? And why isn't he getting this horsepower? So suddenly you have this case where a person's hired to do a job and they're really only holding a position for the younger person in the organization, waiting for that person to come along and take the job. More often than I'd like to admit, we find that once that new person is hired, that next gen is more ready than the preceding generation thought they were. And therefore, the transition isn't as effective as it should be because there's a ready and waiting person there that's only a few years away, and that's never built into the process. Now, take that the other way. If it is built into the process, the person that hires understands that what they're there for is to be a mentor. And that's a great scenario if they understand that, if they understand that their clock maybe has 5 years rather than 15. If that isn't understood coming in, you're being unfair to everybody in the process and sometimes causing tremendous tangled web conflict that
Sure.
won't go away.
Yeah. One of the things that we discuss with families when you have family member employees in the business, that's an important but sometimes unfortunate reality to understand is that when your family owns a company and you work in that company, even if you are very young, it's important to understand that you're living in a glass house. Everyone in the business knows who the family is, and they are watching how the family behaves. And if you have a young family member that is talking to folks at the water cooler about the decisions that people high up in the org chart are making, that's not some intern. That's not some new hire that you got out straight out of college. That's not some middle manager. That's the family speaking. Every single family member is the voice of the family. And when the family dissents towards decisions that are being made, the culture of the business hears that. And that begins the undermining process of the decisions that are being made by other people, sometimes the seniors of the family themselves. And if those people aren't considered in the process, when you go into an executive search process, you meet with a 25-year-old family member. And part of that educates the 25-year-old family member about the fact that they have a powerful voice that their peers that are in their level of the org don't have. It also makes that 25-year-old feel respected and included in a process. And the third point is it educates them on how senior executive processes are managed. And so that they get educated on how to be a informed owner and stakeholder in the future. The final bucket that we want to hit on here is the legacy employee. The person has been around for 20 or 30 years. They're not necessarily going to be considered the next leader of your company. They might be very happy in their role in operations or accounting or HR or wherever it is that they might be. But they have a vast amount of influence culturally in the business. They know everyone, and they're very, very set in the ways that the company's operated for years. Jim, how can that long-term employee support or hurt an executive search process?
Sure. There's an interesting way to look at that, and I think if the company making the change understands the feelings that that person has, and they understand how much their job means to them personally, think of it as space saving. You
Mm-hmm.
need to create a scenario for that executive so that they're honored in the process, even though they're not going to get the top job or the next job, whatever it may be. So the importance here gets back to acknowledging and understanding that that person has real feelings and perhaps has made real serious long-term commitments, is ready for the change, but yet needs to be protected through the change. That's both done by the ownership of the company, but by the person coming in, understanding at the same time that that particular executive is honored and respected in the organization, and that does need to be heard and does need to be listened to. This was, again, there is probably the thing I could go back and forth with here or in all of these is the tangled web of it, because the relationships that go on around that person matter also. How everybody else sees that person matters also, and that it isn't overlooked. And I'm not saying that you should kowtow too much to that individual, but a little bit is okay because they have invested a lot of time in the organization, and um, you need to show gratitude for that and understand the commitments that they've made. And I think that's the way around it. And it's real because this is the one that I think is hardest to see. It's the legacy person that's been there that has more influence than they know and therefore needs to be respected as the transition is happening.
We've seen with companies, these legacy employees cause significant headaches. And those headaches can derail a lot of strategy, but their origin is insecurity related to change. If you've been in a business, if you've been employed by a company for 20 to 30 years, and for the very first time, new leadership is coming in and you know it's happening, and you're not informed and you're not communicated with, all you can see happening is a giant change behind a curtain, and you do not know how it impacts you. And all that's left for you to do is imagine and discuss with your peers about what's going to happen. And now you start thinking about maybe I should change jobs. What are they going to do to my pay? What's going to change? And that insecurity um, only manifests as trouble. And it's just a question of how much trouble it causes. And the way that we get through it, and we're big advocates for radical transparency. You're not talking to your legacy employees because they're going to be promoted. You're talking to them so that to encourage them to be confident and feel involved, and that the decisions that the family is making for their business are for the benefit of everybody, and that the decision to bringing in new leadership will be a good thing, not something to be afraid of.
Having gone through all of these different scenarios many times as a firm, I think the one lesson we'd like you to walk away with here is that the landscape for succession is very complex. There are all sorts of different peaks and valleys in it. We've talked about the peaks today, the people in the background that can influence the way it works. We encourage you, as you get ready to do this sort of thing, a succession, to understand the lay of the land, the people that will influence this, and know their issues and understand how to coach and mentor them through the process.
If you're wondering if your family, or perhaps one of your clients, if you're not a family business yourself but you work with families, is ready to address succession planning, you can visit our website for all sorts of free resources, including a readiness assessment, as well as an ebook about hiring non-family executives, and a wealth of perspective that can help you explore your own journey in succession planning in your family company.